Thank you very much for joining us for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Elaine Zelby from SignalFire to discuss product-led growth strategies for startups. Thanks so much for joining us, Elaine.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here.
Now, just a brief background on Elaine. She is the principal and director of growth at SignalFire, a seed stage data-driven venture capital firm with $1 billion in AUM across 5 funds that invest in startups leveraging data and technology solutions to upend substantial markets. Prior to that, she was a growth and marketing lead for Consensys for a year. And prior to that, she was at Slack on the enterprise product marketing side. She started her career at Capriza, director of product marketing for 5 years. And she has a MS in mechanical engineering and a BS in biomedical engineering from Stanford. Let's talk about your operator journey, Elaine. In 2012, you joined Capriza, an enterprise software startup backed by A16Z, CRV, and other top investors as one of the first employees. You spent 5 years building out many of the GDM strategies with a heavy focus on growth and marketing. What lessons did you learn about effective growth marketing tactics that you rely on today?
Capriza was a really great training ground for me as a young professional just out of college, joining an enterprise software company and kind of getting to figure out how to build a lot of the go-to-market channels. I learned a few things, and also at the same time, I had started sort of by accident a consulting company on the side, working with seed and Series A companies on go-to-market. And so while Capriza gave me a really great insight into the enterprise software world, I also got to see consumer, B2B2C, and a bunch of other business models. On the enterprise side, a couple things that I learned very quickly. One is how much incentivizations matter in terms of growing a company. Really understanding who are the players that touch a lead from your side, from the vendor side, who are the different buyers and people in the buying circle on the supplier side, or the ultimately who you're selling to. And so trying to align incentives so that when you pass the lead from marketing as an MQL to inside sales as an SQL to your account executives as an opportunity, a qualified opportunity, what does that two-handed baton handoff look like? And what I mean by that is if you think about a relay race, when somebody is running, when they're about to do the handoff, the other person they're going to hand off to starts running in the same direction before the handoff takes place. So there's a point in time where you're both actually running together and you have two hands on the baton. And that's exactly what needs to happen in terms of any kind of lead lifecycle on the enterprise side, is you need to think about what are those places where you have a two-handed baton handoff and how do I incentivize that to happen? Great example on inside sales by really understanding the way that they're incentivized, which is essentially comp. You can set the bar in terms of how they're getting comped into what you need to happen. So if you need to say, hey, we're only going to comp you on meetings that have both the business buyer and the technical buyer and these 3 pieces of information checked off, they're only going to do that, which is amazing because if that's what you need to happen. So I definitely learned a ton about incentivization there. And happy to get into any of the lessons I learned on more of the consulting side, working with B2C, B2B2C companies.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A lot of people think that selling to B2C is the same as selling to B2B, but there's a very clear difference between the users and the buyers. Understanding the difference between both of them is really important. But it's also interesting how you talked about what you learned about internally at Capriza and how to manage all those internal sort of stakeholders who are touching the users and the buyers and how to incentivize them. A lot of people think you can apply the same incentives to someone who's at the top of the funnel and someone who's at the very bottom, let's say in customer success. But what it sounds like you learned was that you can't treat everybody the same inside the company as you can outside the company.
Absolutely. One other thing I'll give you here, which is one of my favorite growth hacks that I created at Capriza. At one point in time, I was running 8 webinars a week, and they were some industry focused, some were more product and security focused, but ultimately webinars were a really great growth channel for us to get qualified leads. But what I realized was in webinars, even today, you have usually like a 50% attrition rate. So the people that sign up for a webinar, less than 50% or around 50% will actually attend. In addition, webinars tend to be longer. It's a lot of time on both sides. It's time to give up for you as the employee, and then also time for somebody that wants to go and learn about your solution. So I created this concept of what I call the 5-minute webinar. And the idea is it's really just a gated 5-minute video that's usually a product demo and high-level overview. But because you're calling it a webinar, people are comfortable giving you their information and having a gated page. You would never sit and watch a 5-minute video though, but ultimately it's just a static video. So again, it's kind of thinking through the psychology on the buyer side, but ultimately what information do I need to relay to them to get them excited? And I was able to condense that into 5 minutes. The 5 minutes I knew were going to get them on the hook. And from there, we had 100% of people that gave us the information watch the video, and it was a much higher qualified lead for our sales team.
That's an amazing growth hack, and I'm going to definitely have all of our companies try that out this week.
Please.
So after a brief stint at Slack, where you led the enterprise product marketing side, you got extremely interested in blockchain and joined Consensys, where you built the product marketing and growth teams. What lessons did you learn about storytelling that you rely on today?
Oh man, everything is telling a story. What got me really interested in the blockchain space was a lot around just trying to open up new opportunities for industries and removing rent-seeking middleman and really kind of creating this meritocratic society. It's very idealistic, but I think I personally really buy into that. And, allowing value to accrue where it should, and not just because people have put themselves in the middle of a transaction flow. At Consensys, it was really interesting because we were a venture studio model where we were incubating around 50 different companies, building different types of applications on the Ethereum blockchain. Everything from financial solutions, things around supply chain, things around self-sovereign identity, consumer products for gambling and prediction markets, everything in between. And ultimately, there is a story that people in blockchain like to tell that's very heavy in the decentralization, and it feels almost cult-like. But ultimately, what the users care about is simplicity, user experience, less friction, things like that. And so I spent a lot of time while I was at Consensys and actually started a blockchain marketing meetup specifically around this idea of how do we take some of the great storytelling power that we have as people in this new industry, but as opposed to focusing on the confusing aspects, how do we focus on what it does to the user? What is in it for you? When I work with a lot of our portfolio companies on messaging and positioning, and when I go through their websites or landing pages or content they're putting out there, oftentimes people revert to, here's what I'm doing, here's our solution. But ultimately, your customer wants to know, but what about my problem? And so always having this customer problem focus and starting there, and then from there kind of, continuing out the story. I think that's a really great way to frame everything. It's not about you, it's about them ultimately. And if you can make it about them, ultimately it'll come back to you in spades. The other kind of hack that I always give people is if you're putting together any kind of presentation or story, or you're going to give a talk, I have people, whether you have a slide deck or not, write down one sentence that you want to convey on each of the slides or each of the different points, the sections, and then string those one sentences together as a paragraph, and then read the paragraph through. Oftentimes you'll find it does not tell a comprehensive story with a beginning, middle, and end. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the information is wrong. Oftentimes it's out of order. Sometimes you made a mental jump from here to there, but you lost your audience because there was a big gap. So can you fill in that gap? So it's a great way to kind of think through, is this presentation I put together actually telling a story, or is it just cobbling together a bunch of points that I want to get across?
That's really interesting. I mean, you probably had so many different stories that you had to pitch and tell working at Consensys with a venture studio model, and taking something that is extremely complicated like blockchain, and instead of focusing on the solution of like how you got there, focus on the outcome of what it does to change somebody's life or problem that they're facing day to day. And sometimes with founders, we find that because they're working so close to the problem they're trying to solve day to day, they forget about how to focus on what it does for their users and just talk about how they get there in the first place. And sometimes people don't really care how the sausage is made. They just want to know it tastes like a good sausage. And so that's really interesting to hear you focus on that. And that's really great advice for sure.
One additional point I'll add on that too, to your point around nobody really cares how the sausage is made if it tastes good. There's usually two frames of a story in general. You can either be selling opportunity and possibility, or you could be selling fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I don't think you can do both, and you need to pick one and really own that as the frame. And certain industries lead themselves to one or the other naturally. Some you actually have the choice. But ultimately, you need to make the decision of, are you trying to elicit those feelings? Like which of those feelings are you trying to elicit in your audience? And make sure you create the story and create the presentation around that feeling you're looking to get.
That's awesome. Well, I'd love to talk about your transition to venture capital. So in 2018, you joined SingalFire after having worked with a handful of their portfolio companies in a growth marketing consulting capacity. Can you tell us about the differentiated approach that SingalFire has to investing and what excites you most about joining them?
Yeah, I think it's very rare that you have the opportunity to spend so much time with a team before joining, where oftentimes you get to know people and you think you have an idea of what you're walking into, but you never really know until you're on the inside. But I had been building a relationship with SingalFire for years. And so I really got to understand how they operate, why they're different, and that it was a good fit for me. And so at SignalFire, we're a slightly different take on venture capital. We're the first VC that was built from the ground up as a technology startup ourselves. And so what that means is we have a team that builds product. We think in OKRs and NPS scores. We have a bunch of engineers and data scientists, which make up about a third of our team. A third of the team is on what we call portfolio support. This is kind of our platform approach to really taking a holistic experience for our founders of having in-house recruiting, PR, growth, business development, and those type of functions. And as I mentioned, like a startup, we build product. And to figure out what products to build, we interviewed a few hundred early stage entrepreneurs. And we asked the question, after you fundraise, what are your biggest challenges? And ultimately built products to match against the most common founder pain points. Number one of which came back as recruiting. So oftentimes you raise money, what are you going to do with that but deploy it into people? So we created a proprietary SaaS platform that helps track and rank the best talent across the globe. And we give this to our portfolio for free. The other area we really differentiate ourselves is on having a very networked approach. I always like to joke that as humans, we're A+ at one, maybe two things at best, but B- at everything else. And if a founder comes to us with a question, if I'm not the A+ answer, I'm going to find it, even if it's not within our team. So we surrounded ourselves with about 90 advisors who are investors in the fund, and they work either in a one-on-one capacity or a many-to-many capacity with our founders.
That's amazing. And I heard that when you joined SignalFire, you actually didn't know what venture capital really meant. And so you had to Google a bunch of terms about what venture capital is. Do you understand what it is now?
Yes, I will definitely say, not that I didn't know what it was. It was more around, there's very specific language associated with any industry. And I got my first taste of this at Capriza when I spent a couple months in Washington, D.C., trying to sell into the federal government. I literally was Googling every 3-letter acronym there was. But venture also has a language. And so spending the first 6 months just truly understanding the language people were using, which is an important component of it. I think it probably took me a year to feel like I had it pretty fully down, and I'm still, learning stuff every day. And there's complicated terms that come up only once in a blue moon that you're, going to have to deal with. But but it's been a fun learning curve.
That's awesome. Well, I'm still Googling a lot of the terms every single day, so don't feel so bad. So let's talk about product-led growth strategies for startups. So there's been a huge rise in product-led growth startups like Twilio, Atlassian, Datadog, Stripe, DocuSign, and very many more. So, I would love to understand how you define product-led growth in your mind.
I think of product-led growth as the ability to create some kind of B2B network effects via the product to scale either intra-team or inter-team, like inter-company. It's not really a formal definition. It's more about if you know whether this is a product-led growth strategy or not. That's kind of how I think about it. And that takes the form of a lot of different things that we can get into in a little bit.
Absolutely. So we talked about this a little bit earlier about your time at Capriza, about how selling B2B SaaS is not like selling B2C mobile apps, for example. Absolutely. So how do you differentiate between product-led versus sales or marketing-led strategies as a startup? And when should you start thinking about it?
Yeah, I usually break things down into two different dimensions. One is, what is your go-to-market channel? And then what is meaning, are you B2B, B2C, B2B2C? Those are typically the only three, meaning who is the end target for your product? And then the second piece is essentially tell me your price point and I'll tell you your strategy. So if your price point is going to be in the high tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, there's no doubt in my mind that you're going to have an enterprise sales team. And that is going to be a sales-led go-to-market. If your price point is in the tens of dollars, sub $100, that is going to absolutely be a marketing / product-led product. Like, you're not going to go and hire a fancy, expensive team for that. If your product is somewhere in between, in the, call it thousands to tens of thousands, you are likely going to have a more hybrid, but it's going to be a marketing driven plus inside sales driven plus product driven. Typically, you're not going to only have one. Some people talk about Slack as being, very product led growth. But again, Slack does a lot of marketing. Slack has a sales team. So it's usually a combination. One typically takes the forefront. And so I think a lot about price point and ultimately what is the capped LTV going to look like? What is the, ROI calculation ultimately for that?
Right. So when should you start thinking about those product led growth strategies if you're still figuring out your pricing within the framework of understanding you're not $1 million enterprise contract business? So let's say you're in the hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, I think people know surprisingly early whether they're going after large enterprise, mid-market, SMB, or consumer. And so I think ultimately that's a product decision that even in your MVP, you will have had to take into account as to what features you build, what the product looks like, how you access it, whether there's a self-serve platform, whether it's, gated, how much hand-holding it needs. And so I think from that point in time, once you make that decision of what the product looks like, and ultimately that dictates who you're selling to, I think that's when you need to really be clear about what your growth strategy is going to look like.
Totally. That makes sense. And so focusing on the key frameworks that you can use for product-led growth. So when it comes to implementing a product-led growth strategy, there are a multitude of frameworks out there that can help you. Which ones do you often recommend to your portfolio companies?
I'm not a big framework person, which I know is controversial. I think oftentimes people rely on frameworks a little bit too much and expect that what worked here will work there. And I really don't like that model. It's actually funny with our portfolio companies, I have a network of about 40 to 50 growth experts who are contractors and freelancers. And they used to be in-house at a company, but have opted to go and now work as, a free agent and get to see a lot of different companies and different business models and different sectors. And what I love about these people is they come in with a totally fresh mind every single time. They're not coming and saying, I've done this at company X. I've been there for 4 years. I'm going to take what worked at X and port it to Y. They're coming in and saying, look, I've seen 8 models work well. It just depends on your company. I'm a very big believer in using data to help you figure out how to turn the levers and knobs and ultimately figure out how to get that flywheel going. But I'm not a huge believer in just following a prescriptive framework.
That's fine. I mean, at certain stages, I assume you can test a bunch of different things. And as you start to graduate your way through figuring out different models that work, then maybe you can start to think about the frameworks that make sense. But at the early days, it sounds like everything should be tried and there should be no rigid structure for how you think about building a product-led growth team or framework, right?
I think one of the biggest things too is just holding enough variables constant. So oftentimes what I find people doing at the very early stages, especially if they're trying to implement some kind of product-led growth, is tweaking too many things at once and not being able to attribute what actually is working or not working. And so ultimately having a little bit of patience, which I know is incredibly hard, even for me at the early stages of a company, but trying to give each test you run the appropriate amount of other things that you do not test and giving it enough time to run so you can actually make a valid decision as to how is this working for us? Are there ways to optimize it? Should we kill it? Should we double down? Things like that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I guess without thinking about the framework side, you must have some how-tos on how to implement a product-led strategy. So, it's obviously fairly easy to be convinced that product-led growth is the way forward, but how do you go about acting on this effectively?
Yeah, one way I really like to think about is think through every touch point that your user, so assuming this is a bottoms-up model. So anybody can come in, whether it's a freemium product or whether it's paid, but you put in a personal credit card or corporate credit card and get using. What are all of the different ways that that user comes in contact with either team members or external parties? And is there a natural point within that flow? So I mean, truly mapping out every possible touch point. Where are the natural points where you can make aware the other people about this product, which might be relevant? Part of it has to think through, at Slack, we had a term that we use called wall to wall. And the idea was there is wall to wall within a team. So if an entire team is using Slack, that's considered wall to wall. And then there's wall to wall within an entire company. So if you have a product like Slack that is addressable horizontally across every business unit at a company, your wall to wall might look like every single employee at that company. That's actually pretty rare. Most different types of SaaS products do not touch every person at a company. And so wall to wall for Figma might be the entire design team. So thinking through, okay, there's designers, but also are there other people who also might need to use this? Are, your front end engineers, are they people that actually touch the design and need to collaborate in Figma? And then can they spread that? So I think that's one way I really like to think about early is all the different touch points with internal and external parties. The next thing on that is thinking through user experience. And so I think there's a lot of magic in first run experience. So the first time user experience, it's called a bunch of different things. What does that look like? What does that feel like? How successful can you get a person? And ultimately, it's identifying as quickly as possible what is the magic point where that user is going to be a sticky user. And it's different for every company, and it's going to take a while to figure out what that is. But once you figure out what that is, all you need to focus your energy on is making that first time user experience, get that user to that point. And from there, you'll have a little bit more of a self-fulfilling process because you can have people coming into the top of the funnel. You you get them to the point where you know they have a high likelihood of being sticky. And from there, it's a little bit like magic. A company that everyone loves to reference because they've done a great job, both in terms of creating some processes around this, but also being public about it is Superhuman. And I'm a user, but what I took away from my experience with the product that I think they've just done exceptionally well is not even their onboarding. Their onboarding, it's fine, whatever. But I got dripped emails at a very particular cadence with bite-sized information going forward. So I think for the first couple of weeks, you get one new item that you can do in Superhuman every day. And it has you do it right there. But as opposed to saying, awesome, here's 17 ways you can use Superhuman, which is typical for many freemium products. They said, no, that's way too overwhelming for the user. I will give you one thing today and one thing tomorrow. And if we see you not using this other feature function that we've already taught you about, I will send that to you again in 3 weeks. So I think being very particular about how much information you give or don't give to your users is critical.
Yeah, it sounds like they really mastered that habit loop formation rather than just doing a spray and pray of all these different features at once. They've dripped it all into you very slowly, create a habit loop on each one individually. And then by the end of the cycle, you've got so many that you're addicted to that you need to start continuing to use them every day. And that's a great segue into the problem we see a lot of the time with onboarding and how it's so essential to the success of product-led growth. So after you sign up for a new product like Superhuman, it can be overwhelming sometimes as all these new features and you don't know what to do with them. So what are some of your best tips for user onboarding as it relates to product-led growth?
Yeah, I think I actually just gave most of the things that I think are super critical. It's focusing on getting people to that magic moment. It is not overwhelming them with information or tooltips or wizards or things like that. It's ultimately giving them a simple enough product at the onset that feels like something they can wrap their head around and get using as quickly as possible. I mean, like the time to productivity, and productivity can be defined in any way your product wants to define it. Time to productivity is so critical. And then time to stickiness is so critical. So those are really the key components to focus on.
Do you think it's important to start with the biggest impact features right away or save those for a bit later on so they don't feel like the flash in the pan, amazing experience right at the beginning and then everything after that is useless?
I think it depends. Ultimately, the one framework I actually do like is the whole concept of jobs to be done, which is less of a framework and more just a question to ask yourself as thinking through how you build product and how you essentially build onboarding flows and growth flows. If the job to be done for this user is that big, massive feature that you were just describing, I think it's really important that they can start using it immediately and see the value. If it's not, if the job to be done is much bigger than that, and there are some features that are going to be helpful, but not all encompassing, I think ultimately getting them using something that has value, but is also the simplest is probably going to be easier to make it sticky.
Yeah. So making sure you have those need to haves versus those nice to haves evenly distributed across the onboarding journey. That makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. Like a good example, just coming back to Superhuman, because I think it's an easy one for people to wrap their heads around, is the job to be done for their user base is I want to do my email faster. I mean, they're very singularly focused on we will make the fastest email experience. Ultimately, and I'm so excited they've launched this because I sent them many emails of feedback. I wanted to be able to create a calendar event within my email client. Now you can do that, and that's amazing. But ultimately, that wasn't my job to be done. That's just a nice to have.
That's amazing too, that you had some impact on that feature maybe.
I'm sure I was not the only one requesting that feature.
We'll give you some credit though. So I know you're a big fan of startup communities. So where do you think community and growth can fit together and how startups can think about building communities into their growth channels?
So this is a fascinating space. And we have a company in our portfolio called Comstore, which is really trying to help give light and give a little bit more data-driven approach to community management to better grow your community, better turn them into champions and customers and things like that. But what I've been seeing over the last 3 years is a very growing trend towards not just developer-facing companies, but any company using community as a huge marketing arm, sales arm, and retention arm. I think as humans, we crave being a part of something, and we crave finding like-minded people or some people that share some similarities and commonalities. And companies have been a little bit later to the game for the most part. I think the wave really started with developer communities, who was a lot more organic, that companies then tried to create a still organic way to own a little bit of that conversation. Now we're seeing companies being very, very proactive in recognizing the fact fact that if we build a super strong, vibrant, self-fulfilling community and also provide them a lot of value, it not only elevates our place in this specific market that we're in, but it generates new leads and customers for us. It generates our entire marketing arm, not entire, but it generates pieces of our marketing arm. It helps in terms of, when they move companies, they're going to take this community with them. So I think that's become a really big strategy outside of just developer communities. And it's really cool to watch it grow. I predict that it's going to continue to grow significantly over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a free focus group for your product as it's starting to develop, but also as they start to become power users, you're right. They take it to where they go. If you don't have Figma at a new company that you were using Figma at before, you're probably not likely to join that company unless they buy you Figma to start using it there. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that as well. Do you have any favorite product-led growth resources that you recommend people check out that you tend to rely on?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't really have any on the top of my mind. I read so many blogs and newsletters and things like that. But one thing I'm really horrible about is remembering where it came from. For me, I'm more interested in, is this information novel and helpful and interesting, less of where did it actually sit. I'm a huge fan of the Women in Product group, which I think has done a fantastic job around all things product.
Well, we've read the OpenView blog and shared that around a bunch. I loved reading that one. It was an incredible, advice and interview from founders that focused on the product-led growth side. I know Hooked is a great book that's essential for a lot of people on how to build habit-forming products. And there's obviously the Product-Led Summit, which is 150 experts speaking on product-led growth strategies. So we'll definitely make sure that we share those with everyone listening to the show.
And I will say I get most of my information from podcasts today. And so that's a great wealth of information for people. What I find too is oftentimes you could read a book, and books are fantastic, but ultimately books have a certain length because they need to fill it to sell. Whereas I can take the author of that book and listen to them on a 20-minute podcast, and I get all the meat from that book. So one of my life hacks is literally, if there's a book you want to read, especially a business book, go do a quick search for podcasts with that author talking about the book. You'll get all the high, like the gold nuggets from that.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir, and you definitely jumped to our question here. We hear that you're obsessed with everything audio, podcast, smart home, connected car, and everything in between. And you have your own podcast called Unsexy, where you uncover the stories of niche and esoteric markets with exciting entrepreneurs. So we know why you're excited about podcasts, but have you made any investments in the space to date?
Yes, indeed. So one of our portfolio companies is called Red Circle, which is, in our opinion, one of the best ways to grow and monetize your podcast. So you should definitely check them out at redcircle.com. They're building tools for all forms of podcasters to help them create better content, essentially host it, so get it syndicated to wherever people listen. As many of you know, it's a very fragmented market in terms of how and where people listen to podcasts today. But ultimately, one of the challenges in this space, because podcasting is this very democratized form of media, is finding new listeners. So how do you grow? And then ultimately, how do you make money and be self-sustaining? And so that's what Red Circle is targeting right now.
Well, I'm hoping you're using it for your own podcast, and I'm definitely going to check it out for ours.
Of course.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to get into my favorite part of the talk, which are your book recommendations. And you have 3 books here. Can you tell us why you like each one of these and why the audience should give them a read?
Totally. Okay. So, let's start with one that gets referenced often. And I was pretty skeptical by how cheesy the title was and how old the book is, but How to Win Friends and Influence People. I find sometimes things that are almost so obvious that it's laughable to be the most insightful, in that when you actually read it and really listen to it and even go back a second time, you realize that in life in general, people try to overcomplicate things. And if you actually spend the time, and what I think this book does a fantastic job of, is trying to uncomplicate things and really, pare things down to the brass tack. Ultimately, that's really what you need to do to succeed. And so I thought that book really did a fantastic job of that. Never Split the Difference, to me, was just a fascinating read about negotiation and how negotiation applies to everything in life, whether it's business, personal, relationships. This story, I love how much it pulls in anecdotes. So Chris Voss was a hostage negotiator for the federal government for decades. And he brings in stories that he learned through his time there He also teaches at business school. He relates stories that you think are wholly unrelatable to your life in ways that are so relatable. And I just thought the anecdotes and stories here were pretty fantastic. And the last one is a little bit of a curveball. So Anthony DeMello was an Indian Jesuit priest and psychiatrist. So not things you would typically think of. He lived in England, I think, for a vast majority of his life. And he brings the most fascinating and hilarious looks at life. I wouldn't want to say this is like a self-help type book, but it's one of those things where for anybody who cares about mental health space, about just kind of personal satisfaction and looking inward, but also laughing at the absurdity of how many things we care about. I think this book is just so eye-opening. And this guy is hilarious. I mean, this is true comedy, but it's a lot of his actual teachings and talks and things like that. But oftentimes it's literally just talking about the absurdity of humans and the absurdity of the way that we think and the way that we act. Highly recommend that book.
That's incredible. I've read 2 of the 3. I've done the Chris Voss masterclass and read his book, and I definitely agree on the Dale Carnegie book. It's old school, but it brings relationships to its true meaning and understanding. So highly recommend that one as well. So I'll have to check out Awareness after this. Now, before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for any final words of inspiration for our audience.
Man. Well, one thing that my dad always used to say, which are just kind of words that always stuck with me, is that happiness is an underrated commodity. And what I love about that is I think so many people, especially in our industry, in the tech world, in the coast, in any major city, people get so caught up in comparing themselves to others and the shoulds. I should be doing this. I should have this. And I think people sometimes forget that there are simple things in life that actually bring a lot of joy. And so really focusing on the fact that if you live a joyful life and you find yourself to be a happy person, that's really ultimate success, and not overlooking that and not focusing on the should.
That's awesome. I absolutely love that. And especially in a tough year like 2020, I think a lot of people are reflecting on the things that they are happy to have during a time like this. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the tank today, Elaine, and sharing your thoughts on product-led growth strategies for startups.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.